I come from a background of doing romantic relationship research. And, there's been quite a big field in psychology doing relationship science. But I do think that one thing that relationship scientists have missed is the idea that maybe single people might be happy. Um, it makes sense in a lot of ways that, in the history of relationship science, it wasn't always a field that was taken seriously. A lot of psychologists back in, say, the 1960s or 1970s didn't really think that relationship science was a very serious topic. And so it was a field that really had to fight for its legitimacy. And when the field started finding things like, people who are more socially connected are physically healthier and live longer, that was the kind of data that we liked to trumpet in order to justify, us receiving grant funding and that kind of thing. But I think what might have gotten lost in all of that is we weren't really thinking what that meant that we were saying about single people. And along with society, a lot of narratives in our field were starting to develop that essentially there was something wrong with being single, or that it wasn't possible to be happy being single. But things have started to change. In addition to relationship science, I think now sort of being a more secure field where we don't need to be so defensive about what we're doing, society is changing. So, for example, here in Canada, the number of people who are living alone has gone up dramatically over the past 40 years or so. And not everybody who lives alone doesn't have a romantic partner, but there's a fairly high percentage of people who live alone who are not in a romantic relationship. So suggesting that there's been a larger number of people who are living without romantic relationships. Another relevant data point is that people tend to be marrying later. So spending more of their time, even if they do end up in a romantic relationship, spending more of their time single before they get there. And for the record, when I talk about single people, what I'm referring to is people who are not in a romantic relationship. Okay, so if I were to talk about unmarried people, that's not necessarily the same as single people. So when I'm talking about single people today, it's people not in a romantic relationship. But so this trend of people living more often single and longer single, it's not just a Canadian trend. So you can see that there is a general trend around the world for increasing rates of people living alone. It's actually funny because that's the Polish data right there. And at least for this metric, Poland is a bit of an exception where something happened around 2010 where all of a sudden people were not living alone anymore. I don't know what happened there, but Poland and these data have been fairly flat. Katarzyna, I'm sure, knows the Polish situation better than I do, but I just thought it was interesting that Poland might have been one exception here. But in general, around the world, more and more people are living alone. And I do think that that's something that we've become a lot more attentive to. Here in Canada and the United States, we tend to run studies on ourselves and assume the rest of the world looks like us. And I think it's important to notice that this is something that's happening around the world. So, this has drawn a lot of attention to the issue of singlehood and how happy single people are. And this is partly because the data is starting to speak to scientists, but this is also because single people are starting to speak out for themselves. So, for example, Bella DiPaolo has been a very influential advocate challenging some of the research that's been done, suggesting that there's no such thing as a happy single person, right? And I think that there's kind of a growing community of single people who are standing up and saying, you say that I'm not happy, but I am. So explain that. And to a large extent, that's sort of the challenge that our lab has tried to take up. That what we're interested in doing is examining what predicts who's happy as a single person. And when we started this work, there was, a little bit of data out there, but not very much. And, in labs like Katarzyna's and ours, I think that we're starting to be able to point to some factors that can predict which single people are going to be more happy and which single people are going to be less happy. And so that's the research that I want to talk about today, is some data where, we just take single people. We're not trying to compare single people to people in relationships in this research. We just take single people and we use variables that we think might be useful in predicting who's going to be more or less happy to try to create a picture of what a happy single person looks like. So in the data that I'm going to talk about today, in the first part, I'm going to talk about people's satisfaction with their family relationships, with their friend relationships, and with their sexual satisfaction. In the second part, I'm going to talk about attachment security. In the third part, I'm going to talk about age. And in the fourth part, I'm going to talk about something that we started to do a little bit more in the lab, is that rather than looking at different variables, one by one, to think about, in people's real lives, they have to prioritize some things over others. And so to start thinking about how does single people prioritize the different parts of their life that may make them more or less happy. And
Geoff, I'm sorry, but
yeah.
you want to share your screen because we.
Oh shoot, I didn't do that.
Yes, I didn't want to.
I'm so sorry, I totally forgot.
No, but we thought that you may want to share your screen.
Okay, so for the record, there are the Polish data that I was talking about. And as you can see, so it is a general trend around the world. It is a bit of a flat line for Poland. The rest of the slides were not that interesting. You didn't miss very much, so don't worry about it. Okay. So yeah, as I said, we'll be talking about attachment security. We'll be talking about family, friend, sexual satisfaction. We'll be talking about age, and we'll be talking about how these different domains get prioritized. What I do want to talk about a little bit more before I get into the research itself is the methodological approach that my lab has been taking, and what I hope that you'll see that we're doing in the studies that I'm going to be talking about. So one of them is the research that we're doing is descriptive, and in psychology for a long time, explanatory research has been valued more than descriptive research. But I really enjoy doing descriptive research, and I think especially in the case of singlehood, it's an important approach to be taking because we just don't know very much, right? One of the ways that I like to put this is what we're trying to do in my lab is draw a map of single people. And essentially, it's like, where do the happy single people live and where do the not so happy single people live, right? So we just want to describe what's going on. We think that's important before we get too much into an explanatory approach. It's also exploratory. So I don't think in any of the research that I'm going to be talking about today, do we have any hypotheses? As I said, what we like to do is we like to identify variables that we think are potentially important in understanding well-being and singlehood, but then just let the data tell us what's important, right? Now, I do think that in order to do that kind of descriptive and exploratory research, a couple of things are very important. One is that it's important to run well-powered studies. That if you're going to do exploratory research, you need to have a big enough sample size that any effects that you get are going to be meaningful. And the other is that we always try to replicate our findings. So we're more than happy to do, a study where we have no predictions ahead of time and just see how the data play out. But we always want to replicate that whenever possible. So you'll also see almost all of the studies that I'm talking about today are studies where we've been able to replicate the effect, and that gives us some confidence that we're talking about something that's real. And the other thing, and I've really enjoyed this in the research that I'm doing, is that psychology got into a lot of trouble in the replication crisis for a lot of reasons, but I feel like one of them is that we always wanted to have surprising findings, right? That if you sent something to a journal and they said like, oh, there's nothing surprising here, you might get rejected, right? But I'm like, I'm not doing a magic show over here, I'm doing science, okay? So what I've really enjoyed is that a lot of the findings that you'll see today, when you see them, they're actually kind of obvious. And I think that that's a good thing. I think that if findings line up with people's intuition, that might be a sign that it's something that's real, right? I mean, everyday people are kind of amateur psychologists themselves. And so if the stuff that we're doing makes sense to everyday people, maybe that's a sign that there's something real going on there. At the very least, I'm not going to keep a finding in the file drawer because it's kind of obvious, right? So just keep that in mind. Some of the findings that you'll see today will not be the most surprising thing that you've seen in your life, but maps are not supposed to be surprising. So let's see how this goes. Okay, so as I said, the first part of the talk today is going to be talking about the role of family, friend, and sexual satisfaction in well-being and singlehood. So this was the first empirical study that the lab did on well-being and singlehood. And the premise here was that, one of the things that people who are single and happy were saying was that, people in romantic relationships say that that's where they get their needs met. But you can get your needs met in multiple relationships, not just romantic relationships. And in the literature, a lot of the discussion had been about emotional support, that when you need somebody to talk to about, stressful things or to share good news with, it's not just a romantic partner who can do that. Your friends, your family, there's other places where you can get those kinds of needs met. But one of the things that we felt was less discussed is, where do single people get their sexual needs met? And our idea was that, you can replace the support you get in a romantic relationship with other relationships, but it might be harder to replace the sexual gratification that you get in romantic relationships with other relationships, right? So that's not so much things that people turn to their friends for. We are doing a little bit of the research in the lab right now, looking at lesbian, gay, and bisexual individuals, which suggests that for gay men in particular, casual sex tends to be more available. And so, you don't necessarily need a romantic relationship to be able to have your sexual needs met. But on average, sexual frequency is much higher for people who are in committed romantic relationships. So we felt that sexual gratification may be harder to replace if you're not in a romantic relationship. So that was kind of the idea that sparked us looking at these variables in the first place. Let's also talk a little bit about what we mean by well-being here, what variables we measured to assess well-being in our participants. So the first thing that we measured was life satisfaction. How happy are you with your life overall? But we were also interested in how happy are you specifically about being single? And that's not necessarily the same thing. You could be, really happy with your life, but not necessarily happy about being single. We were also interested in how much do you desire a romantic partner? We feel like it's a decent measure of well-being that if there's something that you want and you don't have it, that's probably going to be related to lower well-being. And then in the first part of this talk, we were also able to look at, do people actually enter a relationship? And presumably, if you're happy being single, you're less likely to enter a romantic relationship. So, in essence, what we were doing in this study then is we were measuring people's friend, family, and sexual satisfaction and seeing how they related to these well-being variables. Okay, so in order to do this, what we were able to do was to get 3 big existing data sets. So all of the studies that I did here were in conjunction with my former graduate student and just outstanding scholar, Yoobin Park. And this was her innovation in the lab. One of her many innovations in the lab was to use big pre-existing data sets in order to test our research questions. So, she found 3 data sets that had the relevant variables, all of which had large sample sizes and certainly relatively mature participant pools, at least compared to if you're getting a university sample. So this was nice because we were able to instantly test our ideas with existing data and instantly replicate those effects as well. Okay, so what did we find? So in terms of predicting whether single people satisfaction in these various domains predict their life satisfaction, what we found is that the happier single people were with their family relationships, the higher they were in life satisfaction. The happier that single people were with their friend relationships, the higher they were in life satisfaction. But also, the happier single people were with their sex lives, the higher their life satisfaction. And it's worth noting, we did this by entering all 3 of these predictors in a regression equation at the same time. So these effects are controlling for the other effects. So this is suggesting that sexual satisfaction has an independent relationship with life satisfaction above and beyond these other 2 variables. Okay. In terms of whether people were happy with being single, now one of the things about using these big existing data sets is that they're great because you don't have to collect the data, you can run the analyses fairly quickly. But one of the downsides is they don't always have the variables that you want or the variables measured in the way that you wish that they were measured. So in in assessing whether people were happy with singlehood, one of the data sets had no data available. The MIDAS data set had a measure of whether people believed they could be happy without marriage, which we took as kind of a proxy of satisfaction with singlehood. And the PairFam data set, which is great if you're doing singlehood research, specifically asked people if they were happy about their relationship status or happy with singlehood. So what we found is that for single people who were happier with their family relationships, that was actually not related to whether they were satisfied with singlehood or not. The nice thing about the PairFam data set is that it has longitudinal data so that you can test both within person and between person effects, but none of our measures suggested that there was a relationship with satisfaction with family relationships and satisfaction with singlehood. We don't know why that is, but one speculation that Yoobin has put forward that makes a lot of sense to me is that for single people, family can be a bit of a mixed blessing. On the one hand, family is a place that you can go to for emotional support, for practical support. But at the same time, typically, if anybody is going to give you a hard time about, why aren't you married? Why don't you have kids? That might be your family members, right? So it's possible that maybe what's going on here is that there are two effects that are canceling out. For satisfaction with friend relationships, people who were singles who were more satisfied with their friend relationships were happier about being single. And again, singles who were higher in sexual satisfaction were also happier about being single. Okay, so what about how much you want a romantic partner? So again, the data that we had available was not perfect. In one of the data sets, they had a variable which was how much do you desire to get married? And as I said at the outset, being married is not the same as being in a romantic relationship, but we took this as a proxy for how much people want to be in a relationship. The MIDAS data set had no data available, and the PairFam data set specifically asked people, how much do you desire a romantic partner? So what we found is, again, having high satisfaction with your family was not related to whether you desired a romantic partner or not. Having satisfaction with your friendship relationships was also not related to how much you desired a romantic partner. The variable that we found that was related to desire for a partner was sexual satisfaction. So people, singles who were happier with their sex lives, had less desire for a romantic partner. And again, the idea that we went into this with was that sexual gratification might be something that's more exclusively available in romantic relationships. So if you're getting your sexual needs met, but you're not in a romantic relationship, the idea is that might reduce the draw to being in a romantic partnership. So overall, then it looked like sexually satisfied people were less interested in being in a relationship. But does that mean, you would predict then from that if you're more sexually satisfied as a single person, you should be less likely to actually end up in a relationship down the road. So we were able to test that in the MIDAS data set. There are 10-year gaps between the first data collection and the second data collection. And so we could find out if people were married 10 years later. In PairFam, they do the data collection every year and they ask people, are you in a romantic relationship every year? So we were able to tell how likely it is in any given year that somebody was going to be in a relationship. So what predicts whether single people actually get into a romantic relationship or not? So satisfaction with family, it turned out, was not a predictor. Satisfaction with friends was not a predictor. And what was really curious to us was that sexual satisfaction, singles who reported being more sexually satisfied were actually more likely to end up in a romantic relationship, despite the fact that they had said that they were less interested in being in one. Again, we don't know for sure why it is that more sexually satisfied singles are more likely to end up being in a relationship. We did, in some later data, ask singles how attractive they perceive themselves to be, and that didn't seem to be related to this effect. So it's not that sexually satisfied singles are more attractive people and therefore get more opportunities. We think that this might have to do with, so there was a paper that I wrote with my former graduate student, Samantha Joel, where we talked about something that we call the progression bias. And this is the idea that people tend to form commitments in romantic relationships more easily than they think they will. And so what that might mean is that people who start out having casual sexual relationships, they don't intend to make that into a romantic relationship, but you're over at that person's house multiple times a week, and all of a sudden it becomes just easier to leave a toothbrush and easier to leave some clothes. And the next thing you know, you've moved in together, right? These casual relationships can sometimes have a kind of a gravity where they turn into more permanent relationships. It's also possible that some of these sexually satisfied singles were in the early stages of a romantic relationship. So they were having sex with somebody, but they weren't yet ready to label themselves as not single. So that's a couple of potential explanations. But in any event, this certainly led us to think that to the extent that the literature had been focusing on people getting their emotional needs met and whether that was related to people's satisfaction with singlehood, we felt like paying attention to whether singles were sexually satisfied was probably an important thing to do. And, our data do suggest that sexually satisfied singles are happier with life, they're happier about singlehood, they're less interested in being in a relationship, but they're more likely to actually enter one. Singles who are happy with their friendships are happier with their life and they're happier with singlehood, but it didn't seem to be related to whether they desired a romantic partner or not. And singles who were happy with their family relationships were happier with life overall, but that variable didn't seem to be related to satisfaction with singlehood or desire for a partner. Okay. So for the second part of the talk, then, I want to talk about some research that we've done in the lab on attachment security and its relations to people's well-being and singlehood. So attachment theory has been a perspective that has been used in relationship research for a long time now. It's essentially the idea, sort of a Freudian idea, that the way that you're treated in childhood leads you to have certain patterns in your adult romantic relationships. There's a lot of debate in the literature right now about how big the role of childhood actually is. There's starting to be some longitudinal data sets that follow people from childhood into adulthood that suggest that the causal effect of childhood treatment may not be as strong as people think it is. But in any event, I think the part of attachment theory in relationship science that is the most reliable is that you can measure individual differences in people's patterns in romantic relationships along two dimensions: attachment anxiety and attachment avoidance. That these seem to be very useful predictors of people's behavior in relationships. So the dimension of anxious attachment, if somebody is higher in anxious attachment, in sort of colloquial terms, you would call that person a needy and clingy person, right? So the kind of person who, if you have a relationship with them, they want a lot of your time and attention. They want a lot of reassurance. They get their feelings hurt relatively easily. They like to spend a lot of time with you. They get jealous easily. They're more likely to have arguments in the relationship because they get upset and offended more easily. So that would be high anxious attachment people. People who are lower in anxious attachment tend to be less worried about rejection. They're more confident that other people are going to value them and like them and want to be with them. Okay, so that's one of the dimensions of attachment security. The other dimension of attachment security is attachment avoidance. So people who are on the high end of the attachment avoidance dimension are the kinds of people who don't really prioritize their relationships. They tend to be very self-reliant kinds of people. They tend to be very independent people. If you are coming home from the grocery store and you need to carry 8 bags into your house or your apartment, and you're the person who wants to take 8 bags and not have any help in carrying them in, that's more an avoidant attachment thing to do, to want to only rely on yourself. That you tend to think that you're the person who can do stuff best. You don't trust other people. And also, these are people who they don't openly disclose their emotions very much. They don't like to talk about their emotions, and they feel uncomfortable in emotionally intimate situations. People who are lower in attachment avoidance, they tend to trust people. They tend to enjoy connecting with other people. They like to open up with other people. And that kind of open self-disclosure creates opportunities for intimacy. So they enjoy connecting with others. And so, if you combine low attachment anxiety and low attachment avoidance, that's what we would call secure attachment, and the profile that in romantic relationship research has been suggested to be the healthiest, most functional profile. Okay, so that's attachment anxiety and avoidance. Now, uh, what we realized in our lab is that there's literally dozens, hundreds, maybe even thousands of papers, probably just hundreds, that have looked at these individual differences in attachment security and related them to satisfaction in romantic relationships. But there were literally 0 studies that had looked at individual differences in attachment security and related them to well-being and singlehood and satisfaction with singlehood. So that's what we decided to do. In fact, the origin story for this paper is that Yuthika Gurme and Yoobin Park and I were writing a review paper, and one of my jobs was to write the section on attachment and singlehood. And I was writing the sentence, no research has actually looked at the link between satisfaction with singlehood and attachment. And then I was like, we have thousands of data points in our lab that we just haven't analyzed this way. So, I called time out on the review paper, and we analyzed these data just in this exploratory way to see what we could find. So what we did is we took these measures of attachment anxiety and attachment avoidance, and we related them to single people's reports of life satisfaction, of satisfaction with singlehood, and desire for a romantic partner. Okay, so what did we find? Okay, so for attachment anxiety, and again, this is the variable that's about like how needy and clingy and sensitive to rejection you are. People who were higher on attachment anxiety tended to be lower in life satisfaction and tended to be lower in satisfaction with singlehood. So suggesting that people who are higher in attachment anxiety will be less happy in singlehood. Now, one of the things that we've tended to do in our lab is that we're interested in how much of these effects are specific to being single, right? That we know, for example, that attachment anxiety is related to higher levels of neuroticism, which is related to just being or experiencing more negative emotion in general, right? So, is it that attachment anxious people are saying that they're less satisfied with singlehood just because they have a lot of a negative emotion and they're less satisfied with everything? Or is there something specific about singlehood that makes them upset? So the way that we have tested this in our work is that we'll control for overall life satisfaction and see if there's an effect left over related specifically to singlehood. And so we did that in this case, and it did look like even when you control for their overall happiness with their life, people who are more anxiously attached are less satisfied with being single specifically. And this is kind of echoed in our finding that people who are higher in attachment anxiety report that they would like a romantic partner. This was not a big surprise to us. Stephanie Spielman, who's a former graduate student in my lab, has done a lot of research on the construct fear of being single, and anxiously attached people they tend to be afraid of being single. One of the things that goes along with anxious attachment is kind of a sense that they can't get through life on their own, that they need somebody else to kind of prop them up a little bit. So it's not surprising to us that attachment anxiety was associated with not being happy about being single and with more desire for a romantic partner. But what about attachment avoidance? So again, attachment avoidance, if you're high in attachment avoidance, these are the people who are not very comfortable with intimacy, who don't like to open up, who don't like to rely on other people. So with attachment avoidance, people who are more avoidantly attached tended to be lower in life satisfaction. But there wasn't a particularly strong relationship between attachment avoidance and satisfaction with singlehood. The initial effect was significant at p less than 0.05, but this is in a sample of almost 2,000 people. So that effect size is particularly small. And in fact, when we do this same exercise of controlling for life satisfaction, the effect drops to non-significance. I mean, I think that whether it's above or below p.05 isn't really the important thing. It just looks like there's a very negligible effect of avoidance when it comes to satisfaction singlehood. So there seems to be this effect where they're less satisfied with life, but they're not saying that they're unhappy about being single. In fact, when people are higher in attachment avoidance, they're also saying they are less interested in having a romantic partner. So suggesting that there is something about attachment avoidance that's related to less interest in being in a romantic relationship. So that leaves the question then of, okay, so there's this effect where avoidantly attached people are less happy with life overall, but they're not unhappy about being single. So, how do you put those two pieces together? And again, we don't know. This is, as much as I enjoy descriptive exploratory research, when you're not looking for mechanisms, you typically don't have any evidence for any mechanism. So we don't know for sure. But one of the ideas that Yoobin forwarded that makes a lot of sense to me is that, for avoidantly attached people, yes, they're less interested in a romantic relationship, but what some other studies have suggested is that their lower interest is not just about romantic relationships, but about relationships in general. So there's other data that suggests that avoidantly attached people are less interested in friend relationships and less interested in family relationships. And so what we think might be going on for avoidantly attached people is, they're not unhappy about being single because they do like their freedom, they do like their autonomy, but the cost of being someone who's less interested in relationships overall is that relationships are related to higher emotional and physical well-being. So it might be that this link between attachment avoidance and lower life satisfaction might be because of less interest and less engagement in not just romantic relationships, but relationships overall. So in sum then, anxiously attached singles, the picture for them was pretty clear and straightforward. They were less satisfied with life, they were less satisfied with singlehood, and they were particularly likely to want a romantic partner. Singles who were higher in attachment avoidance, they were less satisfied with life, but they were good with being single. They were okay with being single, and in fact, they were less likely than people at the lower end of avoidance to want a romantic partner. I had mentioned, secure singles are the people who would be low in attachment anxiety and who would be low in attachment avoidance. And the pattern that seems to come out for secure singles is that secure singles do seem to be the singles who are highest in well-being. They're the most satisfied with life, and they're the most satisfied with singlehood. What was interesting is that they were not the people who were lowest in desire for a romantic partner. They were somewhere in the middle. So this suggests the possibility, and I've certainly seen this in looking at some of the narratives of people who are single, that these may be the kinds of people who are saying, look, I'm open to a romantic relationship. If the right person came along and actually fit into my life in a way that makes my life better, great. If somebody doesn't come along who's like that, great, because I'm happy with being single, right? And I would definitely say that the central message I've been coming, or the central conclusion I've been coming to, and the message I often try to send is that there's actually a lot of commonalities between happy single people and happy people in relationships because they're happy people. They're secure singles who are not worried about rejection, who are comfortable engaging with others. And so that's, I think that that's an important thing to take away. And it really gels with sort of old-fashioned wisdom about if you want to be happy, you don't look to other people to create that for you. You sort of get right with yourself, and that will put you in a good place to either be a good romantic relationship person or a good single person. Okay. So for the next part of the talk, then I want to talk about age. That I think it's kind of intuitive that the role that a relationship or being single might play in your life is going to change across the lifespan. And so we were interested in the question of whether there are differences in how happy people are about being single at different ages. So to do this, we looked at a couple of different data sets, and it was just pretty straightforward. We got data on people's satisfaction with singlehood, and we got people at a range of ages, and we just took a look at the pattern. And so what we found in our first study is that there was a curvilinear effect, that starting around age 40, we saw that people's satisfaction with singlehood started to increase. And in a replication study, and in this case, this was a study of Dutch singles, again, we found the same thing, that there seems to be kind of an inflection point here around age 40 where singles are reporting more and more satisfaction with singlehood. So, I mean, we think that that's really interesting. I think one of the stereotypes about single people is kind of the old spinster stereotype, right? That older singles are going to be miserable, they're going to be unhappy, and our data suggests exactly the opposite. That if anything, it's older singles who tend to be happier. In fact, we have a paper that just got accepted that suggested, in particular, older women who have low desire for a romantic partner are probably the happiest singles that we've identified in terms of those demographics. Now, it is worth noting that it's not entirely clear why it is that as people get older, they get happier with singlehood. I think one of the things that we need to be keeping in mind here is that there's going to be selection effects. So, there are some people who want to be in a romantic relationship, and there's some people who want to be single. And probably by the time you get into, middle adulthood, a lot of the people who want to be in a relationship have found one. A lot of the people who want to be single have decided that's the life they're going to live, and they set up their life that way. So part of this may just be a selection effect, that the reason you're getting more happy single people is that the single people who want to be single have settled into that life. But the other thing is that there are some data suggesting that just in general, people get happier with life as they get older. So, there's data that suggests that in general, if you look at, for example, well-being across the age span, the lifespan, you find a very similar effect of people starting to get happier around age 40. There was another study that was by Janina Buehler, who looked at people in romantic relationships. How does their satisfaction with romantic relationships change across the lifespan? And she found exactly the same effect, that at about age 40, people in relationships start to get happier with their relationship. So I don't think that this is something that's just unique to singlehood. I think that this is probably more a general age effect where people get happier with their lives as they get older. But I do think it's important to note that to the extent that there are these ideas that it's older single people who are likely to be the least happy single people, the data suggest exactly the opposite. Okay, so maybe I have one surprising effect, one little bit of magic here in my talk for you. Okay, so yeah, those are conclusions, or just what I just said. So for the last part of the talk here, then, what I want to talk about is some, a way that we've been starting to think about happiness and singlehood more recently, which is the idea that, all of the studies that I've talked about here have been, let's look at one thing in isolation, right? Like, let's look at social support, let's look at sexuality, let's look at, your attachment security or that kind of thing. But, in real life, if you're making your decisions about what you're going to do today, you only have so much time and so much energy. And so, you have to make choices. Am I going to spend time with my friends? Am I going to engage in, my photography hobby? Am I going to go to work today? And the question is, even though some of these might predict well-being and singlehood more than others, how do you balance them? What do single people tell us their priorities are in building a happy single life? Okay. So in order to examine how it is that single people conceptualize balancing all of these different domains in building a happy single life, we took this approach, this necessities and luxuries approach, from some research that Norman Lee had conducted. Now, Lee's insight is that when you're thinking about, if I were to ask you, how do you build your perfect single life, that sometimes some of the things that are most important to people are things that they don't think about consciously. So I think there's a really good example of this, which is, imagine that I came to your house or your apartment today, and I took all of your objects out of your apartment. Right now, before I did that, if I had asked you, well, what is the most important possession you have? Like, what's the possession that you value the most, right? That people would tend to say things like, my guitar is really important, or my stereo system is really important, or my expensive camera is the most valuable thing that I own, right? But now, when I've taken all of the things out of your house and your apartment, imagine that I gave you, 100 euros to start buying things back, right? Now, is the first thing that you're going to buy back, is it going to be the guitar? Is it going to be the camera? It's probably going to be food, right? Or it's going to be the refrigerator, or it's going to be the stove. And so the idea here is that if you don't ask these questions the right way, you might not actually get at what are the foundational things that are important to people. So Norman Lee had applied this research to finding out what people think is important in a romantic partner, what personality or different traits are important in a romantic partner. We wanted to use this same kind of method to ask people what's important in building a single life. So in the study, essentially what we wanted to do was allow people to buy their best single life. And the idea from Norman Lee's work is, what you spend with the initial amount of money that you get is kind of like the stove or the refrigerator, the necessities in building a good single life. What you start spending after you've bought those things with a higher budget are kind of like the camera or the guitar, the things that are nice to have, but are people's luxuries. Okay, so the way that we did this then is we recruited a number of participants who were European and American. We recruited those through the prolific participant recruitment system. And also through Gallup, we collected an amount of data from Korean participants. And I definitely think that one thing that our research in our lab has not done as well as is ideal is looking at this cross-culturally. I think that, what it means to be single, what well-being and singlehood is like, what single lives are like, even just what the laws and norms and customs related to being single or not is so different from culture to culture. So this was kind of like one fledgling step in examining this kind of this issue cross-culturally. So what we do is we give people different budgets. We say, here's 160 points to buy characteristics of your ideal single life. And then here's another 160 points. And then here's another 160 points. And so, we think that what people buy with the first 160 points is going to be the necessities. What they buy with the last 160 points is going to be more like the luxuries. Okay. Now, the way that we figured out what domains to offer people to buy is we started with some qualitative research, and we asked single people, what are the things that go into having an ideal single life? And so we coded those qualitative responses and came up with these categories: family relationships, friend relationships, leisure time, mental health, physical health, romance, sex, and work or education. And so that's what we did. We offered to participants, you can buy a certain number of points from each of those domains, and we wanted to find out which of these domains were going to look like the necessities and which were going to look like the luxuries. Okay, so first with our European participants. So what our European participants were buying with the low budget, which we think of that as the necessities, in particular, was good relationships with their family. What you see is that with the last 160 points, their family is becoming less of a priority. So that's the profile of what Norman Lee would argue it looks like when something represents a necessity or real. I mean, this is single people's stoves and refrigerators, basically relationships with their family. Okay. Physical health also seemed to be one of these necessity domains, and mental health also seemed to be one of these necessity domains. So it looks like for our Western participants, family, physical health, and mental health represent the foundation of an ideal single life. Work was something that was important, but not as important, especially initially, as some of these other domains. And then a luxury domain looks like this. So this is the guitar or the camera, where it's not the first thing that you spend money on, but once you've got this foundation down, then you start to become more interested in these domains. So this included friends, leisure time, and our least prioritized domains were romance and sex, right? And I do think if you look at a lot of the popular writing on single people's lives, you would think that single people are obsessed with dating and are obsessed with sexual opportunities. But what single people themselves are telling us is that at least of the domains that they had identified as potentially important to an ideal single life, that romance and sex were in fact their lowest priorities. Okay, so what about our Korean participants? So, something we were quite surprised about is that um, we had expected quite a few differences across these two cultural contexts, but we found a lot more in the way of similarity than we found difference. So in terms of the necessity domains for our Korean participants, again, family relationships, physical health was a high priority. Mental health didn't come out as a necessity per se, but mental health was something that Korean participants were spending a lot of their points on, both with the first budget and with the last of their points. Work also, technically qualifies as a necessity. It's something that's important, but doesn't seem to be as much of a foundation as the family and physical health. And then pretty much exactly like our Western data, friends, leisure time, romance and sex came out as luxury domains. And once again, singles were telling us romance and sex are absolutely at the bottom of our priorities, at least when it comes to this list of priorities. Okay, so for this part of the talk, then, the conclusions are that, singles seem to be telling us that family and health are foundational to a happy single life. Now, of course, these are single people's self-reports of what they prioritize, and we're conducting some research in the lab right now where we're planning to actually follow single people in their day-to-day lives and see how much time do they actually spend in these domains, and does time spent in family and health domains actually predict well-being and singlehood? So this is essentially single people's narratives of what is important for a happy single life. And it remains to be seen how accurate those narratives are. But at the very least, I think that getting this picture of what singles feel like goes into a happy single life is really important. And again, sex, dating, friends, and leisure seem to be less of a priority for single people than these more foundational components. So, as I said at the beginning, what we're trying to do here is draw a bit of a map about where the happy single people live and where the less happy single people live. And in fact, I actually think of that as more categorical that I like to think about this. I think that what we're really trying to identify here are variables that predict who is going to be more versus less happy in singlehood. So from our initial research, if you wanted to try to paint a portrait of the more happy single person, it's going to be people who feel like they have good relationships with their family, who have good relationships with their friends, and who are satisfied with their sexual relationships. It is worth noting that in some follow-up research that we did, being happy with your sex life can mean a couple of things. One can be, I want sex with people and I'm having sex with people. But another can be, I'm not interested in having sex with people. That being less interested in sexual activity is actually related to higher sexual satisfaction for single people. Okay, so being happier with your sexual relationships means getting what you want. And that can either be, I want a lot and I'm getting a lot, or I don't want and I'm not getting. Okay. Um, Also, single people who are higher in secure attachment appear to have higher well-being and singlehood. Singles who are past midlife, and as I suggested, especially singles with low desire for a romantic partner. If you don't want something that you don't have, and you're past midlife, that looks like it's a good place to be. And as I've been suggesting, how singles balance these various domains and other domains that didn't get included in that particular study is an important future direction. I've been able to talk about some of the research that we've got in our lab, painting a picture of what's related to happy singlehood. But there was a paper that Yuthika and Yoobin and I just had published not that long ago, where we did our best to try to review all of the research we could find on what predicts which singles are more versus less happy. And so if you'd like an even more thorough of what picture of what a happy single person looks like, you can take a look at that paper that's in press at Perspectives on Psychological Science. Okay, that's everything that I have. Thank you so much for your time today.